Hello, welcome back to Davenant Academy. I'm Dr. Brad Littlejohn, and this is our class, An Introduction to the Reformation. Today, we will be learning about the spread of the Reformation in the mid-1520s. And this story is going to introduce us to a lot of new characters and new locations and new events, so pay close attention. Now, you may remember that how we left the story last time was that Luther, in the spring of 1521, was on his way back from the Diet of Worms when he was kidnapped by his own Elector Frederick the Wise. Elector Frederick, of course, had kidnapped him so that he wouldn't be captured by imperial forces and potentially burned at the stake for heresy. So Luther is then imprisoned at this place, the Wartburg Castle, and he spends roughly a year there pretending to be a knight by the name of Junker Georg, or Junker George, as we would say in English. Anyway, during this time, although he's cut off from his fellow reformers in Wittenberg, and nobody quite knows where he is, he used the time very well in writing many books in scholarship and in especially translating the Bible into German. This is one of Luther's most important accomplishments. Now, the Bible had been available in German before this, but it was translations that were only from the Latin Vulgate. Luther uses his knowledge of Greek and Erasmus's Greek New Testament to prepare a translation of the New Testament from the original Greek into German. So it's much more accurate than the Vulgate translation. Also, Luther is a great wordsmith. He's a great master of language. And Luther's German Bible, that he does the New Testament, and then later on he and his colleagues finish up the Old Testament as well. The German Bible, which you see pictured here, is credited with really impacting the development of the modern German language, in much the way the English Book of Common Prayer and then King James Bible will shape the modern English language. Now, while Luther's at the Wartburg Castle, the Reformation is being carried on in Wittenberg and in other places by friends and disciples of his. And I want to introduce a couple of key figures that are also central to the Lutheran Reformation. One of these is Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon is a younger friend of Luther. He's just in his 20s when the Reformation breaks out in Wittenberg, and Melanchthon is a professor of Greek at the university. Melanchthon is a great scholar, and he's widely read in many, many subjects. And Melanchthon had some gifts that Luther did not have, whereas Luther tended to, as I said, he had a great flair for language and great flair for rhetoric, and sometimes Luther could get emotionally carried away and write things that he might later regret, or even if he didn't regret them, other people might regret that he had written them. He also wasn't terribly systematic in his writing. He wrote in many of his things were kind of like sermons, and sometimes he would emphasize one thing, sometimes another. Melanchthon was a much calmer personality who was good at diplomacy, good at mediating conflict between different wings of the Reformation, and was good at systematizing Luther's ideas. So he wrote in the year 1521 a treatise called the Loci Communes. I'll just put this here. 1521 Loci Communes, which means the commonplaces. And this is really the first quasi-systematic exposition of Protestant theology. And Melanchthon will revise and expand this Loci Communes, this commonplaces, many times over the course of his career. And it will become a model for Protestant theology. So Melanchthon is considered in many ways almost as important as Luther for the ultimate success of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. And through his position at the University of Wittenberg, where he stays until the end of his life in 1555, 9 years after Luther's death, Melanchthon plays a central role in training many of the future pastors and teachers of the Lutheran Church. Now, another character who's also very important to the success of the Lutheran Reformation is this fellow, Johannes Bugenhagen. Let me go ahead and type that one out for you. Johannes Bugenhagen. Now, Bugenhagen becomes an early follower of Luther and one of his greatest allies, and Bugenhagen's special gift is as a church organizer, a church leader and organizer. So really, Luther, and Melanchthon made a great team. Luther as the guy who has a flair for words and ability to stir up controversy and generate exciting new teaching. Melanchthon, who's able to settle down that controversy a bit, smooth things over, synthesize that teaching, summarize it in ways that can be easily taught. And then Bugan, who's able to put it into practice in organizing new Reformation churches. Because of the church, of course, the churches did have to be reorganized. In most places, the archbishops and bishops of the Catholic Church did not support the Reformation. And so when the city became reformed, the bishop was thrown out or fled, the church needed a new kind of leadership. And often the city councils would take a lead in establishing a new reformed church. And Bugan would come in and offer a structure for how the church should be led, governed, how church discipline should be run, how ministers should be trained, etc. And Bugan did this in many places throughout North Germany. He's also particularly important because he is credited above all with bringing the Protestant Reformation to Scandinavia, to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In the mid-1520s, these rulers become the first major rulers to accept the Protestant Reformation. Remember, Luther had been trying to appeal to the princes for support. He's actually slower to generate support from the princes in Germany than in Scandinavia. And Scandinavia, these three countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, are going to become centers of Lutheranism for the centuries to come. Now, Luther also had some more radical followers who created some problems for him as time went on. So one of these, I don't have a good picture of him, but is Andreas von Carlstadt. I'll go ahead and type that name for you as well. Andreas von Carlstadt. So he was actually the dean of the University of Wittenberg. So Carlstadt, whereas Melanchthon was particularly known for being a peacemaker, right? Luther would say provocative things, and this became a tension throughout the Reformation. Luther would say very provocative things, which meant that there could be a tension among his disciples between who are the true followers of Luther, the people who really took him at his word when he says the most provocative thing. Is that Luther? Is that the genuine Luther? And if you're really serious about this Reformation, you're going to follow the most provocative thing Luther said? Or do you say, well, let's see what he really meant by that. Let's balance it against some other things he said elsewhere and so on. Melanchthon would take the latter route, right? Settle down some of Luther's more dramatic statements. Carlstadt took the former route, saying, no, if we're really followers of him, if we're taking this serious, we need to take all this literally, take the most dramatic statements at face value, and then even go further, spell the implications of those. So Carlstadt, while Luther is at the Wartburg Castle, begins to create trouble by taking the Reformation further in Wittenberg and insisting that lots of things have to change. And some of them were things that Luther himself wanted to change, but recognized needed to happen slowly. For instance, changing the liturgy. Others, however, Luther never really supported, and one of these was iconoclasm. I'll type that word here for you as well. So iconoclasm actually comes from a period earlier in church history, and it means destruction of icons, destruction of images. And this becomes a debate in the Reformation because the medieval Catholic Church the worship was built very much around icons, statues that were pictures of the saints, and were indeed venerated by some people, worshipped, not quite worshipped perhaps, but practically speaking, almost worshipped by many of the Christians who saw them as a sort of having special, sometimes some of them were thought to have special powers, and they really were treated as idols. And the Reformers recognized that this was a problem, but whereas Luther's approach was to say, look, there's nothing important about these images as such. That's the whole point. They're just images that can be useful for us or they can be misused. And the point is to teach people the right use of them. Carlstadt, on the other hand, said, no, we need to destroy them. We need to get rid of them because they've been abused. And this is going to be a tension throughout the Reformation. Things that had been misused by the late medieval church. Do you try to correct the use, keep the thing, and teach people how to use it rightly? Or do you get rid of the thing altogether to prevent any chance of people misunderstanding or misusing it? In any case, Carlstadt is quickly causing riots in Wittenberg. Things are getting very out of order, and people who have been supporting the Reformation, like Elector Frederick, are now questioning whether that was a good thing to do after all. So Luther ultimately says, I've got to leave Wartburg. Things are getting out of control. Luther comes back to Wartburg, preaches some sermons, calms things down, condemns Carlstadt for getting carried away, and puts the Reformation back on a sort of a more steady course. And from here on, Carlstadt becomes increasingly marginalized, and Luther works closely with Melanchthon and Bugan and many others. Now, there are other radical figures who are going to create some trouble for Luther. And one of these is this fellow, Thomas Muenster. Thomas Muenster. I'll write that name down here as well. Thomas Muenster. Now, Muenster was a curious figure who is considered one of the first figures of what's called the Radical Reformation. And Muenster had many teachings that were, in continuity with Luther's, and also some curious ones of his own. And one of the key things that Muenster emphasized was an opposition between the spirit and the letter. The spirit and the letter. And what Muenster's going to say basically was whereas Luther had said, we can't trust the authority of the Pope, we need to get back to the words of the Scriptures. Muenster says, no, we need to get back to the revelation of the Spirit. And the Spirit sometimes speaks directly to the heart of the believer, not just through the words of the Scriptures. So Muenster is actually trying to move beyond Scripture to a kind of private revelation of the Spirit. Now, from Luther's perspective, this isn't taking his Reformation further in the same direction, which is what Muenster thinks. Luther says this is actually failing to reform at all, because really it's the same problem that the Pope has. Scripture is not enough, so the Pope claims the Spirit continues to speak through the Pope and through the Church. Muenster says the Spirit continues to speak through the private revelation that he and others who have been truly illumined have received. And Luther says, no, the Spirit speaks through Scripture alone, and we need to trust that revelation. In any case, Muenster and others of his followers who have this emphasis on the inner illumination of the Spirit begin to preach kind of apocalyptic doctrines, the idea that the world is about to come to an end, and they are the prophets of the end times, about who have been given special insight into what God is doing. And one of the things that means is that the world is being turned upside down, and the existing power structure needs to be overturned. And when Luther had talked about the freedom of a Christian, he had tried to emphasize this did not necessarily mean earthly freedom. So spiritual freedom, it didn't necessarily mean a change of worldly power relations. But many of the German peasants who've been oppressed for many years took his teaching in that direction. And they rebelled against the authority of the lords, with people like Muenster inspiring them, and went on had this hope that they could sort of, perhaps that God would be with them. And even though they were just unarmed peasants, they would be able to win their freedom, to punish the greedy landlords and overturn the social order. Luther was deeply opposed to this. Or initially, he was sympathetic to the peasants for having legitimate concerns, but as time went on, he became very concerned about the way in which they were destabilizing things, that they were out of control. And Luther wrote fiercely against the peasants. Many would say he wrote too fiercely. This is one of the places where he got carried away. He wrote a book against the robbing and murderous hordes of peasants, and he encouraged the noblemen to punish them without mercy. And in fact, they did. Muenster and many others were slaughtered. And that this was a kind of one of the darker moments in the Reformation, but Luther thought it was crucial to make sure that the gospel was not mixed up, perhaps, with this idea of worldly revolution. That just because he was proclaiming a revolution in the church, that did not mean a total revolution in society. Now, at this point, we need to move from, how do I clear that? All right. Move from Germany down to just south of Germany in Switzerland, where the Reformation is also beginning to break out at this time, under the leadership of this fellow, Ulrich Zwingli. Now, Zwingli, I'm just going to say Zwingli. Zwingli is a parish priest who has been highly educated, like Luther, who has read humanists like Erasmus, who has been read Erasmus's Greek New Testament and been very taken with the new insight that it offers. He was also a great student of the Church Fathers, of Augustine. So he seems to have developed many of the themes of the Reformation around the same time that Luther was discovering some of the same things. But it's probable also that he was reading Luther's writings and influenced by Luther as well. Zwingli liked to say he kind of got a lot of it independently. Probably he got a lot of it from Luther. But certainly Zwingli's emphases in many places were different than Luther's. In any case, Zwingli begins in the early 1520s, creating some momentum for Reformation in the great Swiss city of Zurich. And the catalyst for this is a fun little episode, is called the Affair of the Sausages in 1522. This is a picture of Christoph Froschauer. Not going to worry about the name. He's not a particularly important character in himself, even though he did run a very important Reformation publishing business. The Froschauer publishing house was responsible for publishing hundreds of Reformation books over the succeeding decades. But he is also important because at his house in 1522 was hosted the Affair of the Sausages. What was this? Well, it was Lent, 1522. And in the medieval Catholic Church, Lent meant you couldn't eat meat for 7 weeks before Easter. And this was not merely, as it is now for many Christians, it wasn't merely a sort of a good idea, a recommendation, a way of a special way of showing spiritual discipline. No, this was a commandment. This was, if you ate meat, that was a sin against God and a sin against the church. So as Zwingli and some of his friends are beginning to discover the doctrines of Scripture anew, they realize that the Pope, the Church, do not have the authority to make something sin that God has not commanded or forbidden. And this is going to be a key emphasis of the Zwinglian Reformation, but also in continuity with Luther's point in the freedom of the Christian, that you cannot bind the conscience of the believer beyond what Scripture allows or requires. Scripture does not command it. Scripture does not forbid it. Then the church cannot. The church may certainly command and forbid things for the sake of good order. For instance, the church can say, "We're going to hold services at 10:30 a.m. today. Please show up at 10:30 a.m." But they cannot require practices as sort of spiritually necessary for pleasing God, so that not doing it is a sin against God, which is what the practice of Lent had become. So Froschauer hosts a dinner at his house in the middle of Lent, eating sausages. Okay, this causes a great scandal. Lots of people are very alarmed by this practice, but Zwingli defends them and gains the attention of the city council. The city council is persuaded by a lot of what Zwingli has to say, and as time goes on, Zwingli uses his influence with the city council to increasingly institute new reforms in Zurich. Now, here too, there were some radicals to contend with, and these are known as the Anabaptists. So this is not a great picture, but this is a picture of a disputation in Zurich between the Anabaptists on the one hand and Zwingli and his supporters on the other hand. So who were the Anabaptists? Well, the Anabaptists there were several groups. There were some in Germany, some in Switzerland, but it seems as if the Swiss group is perhaps the real origins of what becomes known as Anabaptism. Anabaptism meaning to re-baptize. Nowadays, we just call them Baptists. Modern day Baptists don't necessarily share all the views. They don't share all the views of the early Anabaptists, but they do share a key practice, which is instead of baptizing infants, they baptize only adults, only those who are, or at least those who are old enough to make an explicit profession of faith. So the Anabaptists took Luther's emphasis on justification by faith alone, and they said, well, faith has to be articulated. It has to be a confession of faith, and if you're only saved by faith, then you shouldn't be baptized. Baptism is the mark of salvation. You shouldn't be baptized until you're actually saved. You can't be saved until you've shown faith. You can't show faith until you're old enough. So this is one of the key points that the Anabaptists are making. Luther and Zwingli, and then all the mainstream reformers who are going to follow them, do continue the medieval practice of baptizing infants very soon after they are born. Anyone who is themselves baptized Christian can bring their infant child for baptism, and at that point they are treated as a Christian, treated as a member of the church. The Anabaptists don't like this for a number of reasons, but perhaps the most important is it continued the idea of a church that is completely overlaps with the society. The whole church, the whole society is a Christian society, and the church membership is pretty much the same as the citizenry. In Zurich, everyone is a citizen, everyone is a church member, everyone has been baptized. And for Luther, this was important because, and Zwingli would say this as well, that the true members of the church are known only to God. Those who truly have faith are known only to God. And for our purposes, we have to treat all those who claim to have faith as the visible church, and not try to sort of peer in and figure out who truly has faith and who doesn't. But the Anabaptists saw this as basically an excuse for, or a way of allowing the church to become filled with lazy believers who were not believers, lazy people who were spiritually lazy, who were not committed, who were living in sin, who didn't belong in the church because they weren't really Christians. So let's make a church that's made up of only Christians, they said, people who are truly committed to Christ. And let's have those people be rebaptized. Well, Zwingli opposed this, and the Anabaptists were persecuted and driven out of Zurich. And they were persecuted most everywhere they went. The Catholics didn't like them. The Protestants didn't like them. And they had other radical views in many cases as well. Many of the Anabaptists also taught pacifism. They taught that a Christian should not use self-defense. A Christian should not use weapons at all, should not serve in war, should not serve in the police, and in fact, therefore, cannot serve as a magistrate. So the whole idea of Luther's Reformation, which is to say appealing to the Christian magistrate, to the Christian princes and civic leaders, for the Anabaptists, didn't make any sense, because you couldn't be a Christian really and serve in a position of public authority. So the Anabaptist churches were sort of by definition sort of separated communities, small voluntary separated communities. And the Anabaptists remain very small in numbers, but become important in influence as time goes on. And some of their ideas, as I say, are taken up by the larger Baptist movement in the 1600s and on into the modern day. Now, a final guy I want to mention before we end this survey is this guy, William Tyndale. William Tyndale. Now, he is important because he is considered perhaps the first of the English reformers. First reformer in, oh, that's not very legible. I'm sorry. Let's see if we can, well, there we go. William Tyndale. There you go. William Tyndale. So William Tyndale is a follower of Luther and also of Erasmus and other. He's reading the writings of various of these Reformation-minded humanists and actual Protestant leaders in the early 1520s in England, and he becomes convinced of the need to teach the gospel to the English people who are deeply ignorant, particularly because in England there is no English Bible at all. Remember I said in Germany, at least there were German translations of the Bible, although not very good ones. In England, that's been banned since Wycliffe did his translation in the 1380s. The English Bible is banned, and the priests are responsible for interpreting the Bible, and they use the Vulgate only, and most of them don't know Latin very well. And so you have ignorant priests teaching the Bible. You have common people with no access to the Bible. And Tyndale is determined to remedy this. And so he goes to the Netherlands, where it's a little bit safer, and he works on translating the Bible into English and having it published there and shipped back over to England. When Tyndale was translating the Bible, he famously said that, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life, ere many years I will cause a boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scripture than he dost." And this is Tyndale's vision, is a Bible that is so accessible that every common person can read and understand the Bible better than even the corrupt church leaders do. And this is really part of the Reformation vision of translating the Bible, is the idea of universal education. Literacy was not common this time. And we're going to see as the Reformation goes on, a huge emphasis on teaching people to read and write so they can read the scriptures in their own languages. Tyndale's translation of the Bible is ultimately going to cost him his own life, but it does plant the first seeds of Reformation in England. And that's something we'll talk a lot about in the lessons that follow. So thank you so much for joining me today for Davenant Academy. Look forward to joining you next time as we hear about the events of the later 1520s and early 1530s as the divisions in the Reformation begin to take root.